Hello everyone, welcome to the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast, where light and technology come together. I'm Jason Odell, and today I'm going to be talking about depth of field and subject isolation and how you can achieve that particular look. And I really like isolated subjects as a creative technique because it just makes everything else stand out, and that look of having a real soft, out of focus background is creative in and of itself. And the best part about that technique is that you can do it in camera. You don't need to use software to produce it. Now, I get a lot of questions about soft backgrounds from photographers or people who are just getting started because they say, why does your picture look so much different than mine? You do a portrait with your DSLR versus a snapshot with a point and shoot camera or even a cell phone camera. And the biggest reason, I think at least, is that subject isolation and shallow depth of field that you can get when using a DSLR camera. Now, the way you achieve that soft focus, or I shouldn't say soft focus, but shallow depth of field look comes from a couple of different parameters. The aperture of your lens, the sensor size, the format of your camera, the subject distance or the focusing distance, as well as to a certain extent the focal length, and that would be of your lens. Of these, the two biggest factors tend to be your sensor size and your aperture. So what we have here is some different cameras, and I got all the way from my little iPhone camera here to a Nikon 1 V1 mirrorless camera, which uses a fairly large for its class sensor. And then my Nikon D4, which uses a 35mm format sensor, 24 by 36mm rectangle. The difference between these cameras, besides their features, is the size of those sensors. So the sensor on the iPhone camera is really, really small. And on most point-and-shoot cameras, it's about the size of your pinky fingernail. It's a really tiny sensor. This one's a little bit bigger. This one's still bigger. And if I had a medium format camera, like a Hasselblad or a Phase 1 back or something like that, that would use an even larger image sensor. I point this out because as you go up in sensor size, you're much more able to get those shallow depth of field effects. So part of it is going to be your camera itself. The other part of the equation is the lens that you're using. Now, lenses come in a variety of types, but one of the things when you design a lens is that it has an aperture and an optical size that's determined by just the lens design. So we can look at a couple of different lenses. Here is a Nikon 70 to 300mm zoom. It's a full format lens. It fits on my D4. It covers the 35mm sensor frame. But when you look at this lens, you'll see it's not that big for a 300mm lens. You can read on here the aperture, the minimum aperture. And there's two things about this particular lens that come to mind. This one has a f4.5 to f5.6 minimum aperture. What does that mean? Well, the fact that there's two numbers in this aperture tell me that it's a variable aperture lens. So the minimum aperture at the widest focal length, which is in this case is 70mm, is going to be f4.5. But if I zoom all the way out to 300mm, it's now an f5.6 lens. That's important because I cannot produce an aperture wider than whatever the maximum aperture is on this lens. So this is an f5.6 lens. That means I can't open up any wider than f5.6. If I want to move up to a wider aperture, I've got to buy a different lens. And that has consequences in terms of size, weight, and especially price. So here is the 300mm f4 Nikkor lens, and this one has a 77mm front filter ring. You can see that that's much larger over here than my variable aperture lens. This is an f4, this is an f5.6. So this lens is able to open up physically one stop wider. That gives me an advantage in letting in more light if I'm in a lower light situation, but it also lets me get better subject isolation. Now, if you are a portrait photographer, you probably are going to be using something like a short telephoto lens. And this could be anything from the 70 all the way up to 135 millimeter focal lengths. Depending on how much money you want to spend, you can go and get a prime lens that has a very fast maximum aperture. This is the Nikon 85 millimeter f1.4 lens. It's got a 77 millimeter front filter thread. It's a pretty solid chunk of glass here. It's quite expensive. It's more than $1,000. But if you look at this lens, you can see it's got a huge aperture. So this is f1.4. Remember, our 300 over here was f4. So this lens is almost 4 stops faster than my 300 millimeter lens is, meaning I can use it in dim conditions. But more importantly, if I shoot this lens with f2, f1.8, somewhere in there, or even wide open, 1.4, I can get a shallower depth of field, creating an illusion of subject isolation. The background becomes blurred and the subject remains sharp. And so by having more apertures to play with, I can dial in the precise amount of depth of field that I want just by changing apertures. Another way you can get out of focus backgrounds, regardless of your sensor format or aperture, is to focus closer onto your subject. A couple of ways to do that. When you look at a lens, you can look at the specifications. The lens is going to have a minimum focus distance. So with this lens here, the minimum focus distance, if I just read it off the aperture ring, is about just under a meter, or just under 3 feet, which is close but not really close for this particular focal length. Contrast that against, here's a 50 millimeter f1.4 lens. This guy is a lot smaller, but it's still 1.4. It can focus all the way down to, about half a meter. So this one focuses down to about 1.5 feet. The closer you get to your subject, as long as you can focus on it, the shallower that depth of field becomes. And that's why when you use a lens like this one, this is a 105 millimeter f2.8 micro Nikkor, it's a macro lens. This one lets me focus pretty much as close as I want to. The minimum focus distance is less than 1 foot, 0.3 meters, and it can produce a reproduction ratio of 1:1. So if you're a macro shooter, usually you're trying to stop way down to get as much depth of field as you can. But if you get close to your subject, or you use a telephoto lens, you use a fairly wide aperture, and a camera that has a reasonable sensor size format, you can create these wonderful, soft, out of focus backgrounds. So all of those tricks apply. In fact, even with my iPhone, if I can focus on something fairly close, the background will start to blur. It's just harder to do. So with any of these cameras, the smaller your sensor format is, the wider aperture or closer focusing lens you're going to need to create that out of focus background. Now, when photographers produce images with the out of focus backgrounds, it's nice because it gives us that really cool subject isolation look. And this is a powerful creative technique, because when you're out there, a lot of times you want to create the sense of depth in an image. Maybe even with landscape photography, maybe you're taking a picture of a flower or some tree or something like that. You don't necessarily want that flower to blend in to the background. If the background is too sharp, everything blends in together and you don't get that separation. So by opening up your aperture and using a wider aperture, you're going to start to create an out of focus background, and that psychologically causes your eye to fixate on the sharp subject more than the background. So you get that separation. That's really good. Another thing photographers will talk about is a term called bokeh. And bokeh is just a fancy word for talking about the rendition of typically highlights, just how smooth the out of focus background is. And when you work with lenses that have wide apertures, what we want to do is produce a pleasingly smooth background. And if you've got point of lights, so like lights in the background, like street lights or Christmas lights, anything like that where it's point sources of light. As they go out of focus, what you want to see is them rendered nice and smooth as round circles, and it can be a very pretty look. The way you achieve that is really a function of the lens design. So good lenses are known to have good bokeh. This Nikon 85mm is a classic example. This 50 does as well. And part of the way that the lens designers can make a lens that produces nice, pleasingly round, out of focus highlight elements is by using more aperture blades to create a rounder aperture, and then they can even round those blades. So this 85mm lens, it uses 9 aperture blades to create a more perfect circle when it's anything other than wide open. And these blades are slightly rounded in their design to again create smoother edges. Some lenses, older lenses, you might find the backgrounds look kind of harsh, unpleasant. That's what we're talking about with bokeh. So look for one of those. Now these lenses, again, you can focus closer, use a telephoto, or get a wide aperture lenses. All of those are tricks to get an out of focus background. The problem is that the wider the aperture of the lens, the bigger the front element has to be, the more glass they need to put into it. The design needs to be more complex. So the price really starts to skyrocket when you get into f2.8 and wider lenses. So while this lens here, this 70 to 300 millimeter variable aperture zoom lens is about $700, I think, give or take, my 70 to 200 f2.8 lens costs these days over $2,500. It's much more expensive to make a constant aperture, a wide aperture lens. A 300 millimeter f4 lens, this Nikon, it can be found for under $1,000, especially if you get on the used market. But the 2.8 f2.8 version of this lens, which is going to be much larger front element, that's a $3,000 or more lens. So it really gets to be expensive. They get bigger, they get heavier, and that can be an impact when you're trying to carry these lenses in the field. Now, one lens that just about anybody can get, and it's fun if you want to experiment with out of focus backgrounds, creating nice subject isolation, is one like this, the 50 millimeter lens. Now, this is the f1.4 version of the Nikon, but they also make an f1.8 version, which is only a third of the stop slower. Just as sharp and costs about half. Same thing with this 85 millimeter lens. Nikon makes an 85 millimeter 1.8 lens. This lens here is over $1,000. The f1.8 lens is under $500. Huge cost savings. Almost just as good in terms of sharpness and all that image quality. You lose a third of a stop. So if you're just looking for something to have in your bag and toss in there, it's not too big and heavy, I would recommend getting the f1.8 version of either the 50 millimeter or the 85. Great lenses. So what I want to do is show you some images that I've taken over the years that use those out of focus elements and I'll talk about how I created those images.
Let's start off by taking a look at some images that use subject isolation with relatively shallow depth of field to achieve an artistic vision. This is a classic portrait. I captured it with my 85mm f1.4 lens. I was shooting at f2.8 in this case. But you can see that even with that, I'm fairly close to the subject. I'm probably about 6 feet away. And the background is discernible, but it is soft. Similar with this portrait where I'm even closer. This is your typical head and shoulders shot. Again, the 85mm lens. I'm now at f2. And that out of focus background, which is a plant, and we were just in a hotel lobby when I captured this image, it really just becomes soft, and you don't really have any idea of where the person is sitting when you take the picture because we don't have that context from the background, so it works well here. Now this shot, this is with my 50mm f1.4 at f1.8, so I was just barely stopped down. The background is out of focus, and that's great, but you get the context. You can still recognize sort of the objects in the background. I mean, there's the dog back there and some toys, and the baby gate, but your eye goes right to the face of the subject, and it works for this kind of image. And here's some shots that I did that combine close-up with relatively shallow depth of field. This is with my macro lens, that 105mm lens that I showed you earlier. Took it at f4 because I'm fairly close to the subject. You can still see the background. You get an idea of the context that we're in a tulip field there, but the flowers in the background are just rendered as a blur of colors, and the sky just becomes sort of a bluish stripe. Works really well for this image. Here I'm using a longer lens. I'm using the 70-200 f2.8. Again, I'm at f4, so I'm not wide open, but I'm fairly open. The background becomes soft, but you still get the context. You're out somewhere in a field, there's a blue sky. You have an idea of where you are at. You get a sense of place. Even though the background is out of focus, it doesn't distract from the image. This one, I did a similar thing. I wanted the context of the background to show the buildings in Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, but I wanted the subject to be the fence and the flowers. So I got fairly close with my 70-200. I'm at 90mm in this case. f4, just to get a little bit of depth of field. The background goes soft, and I don't know if you can notice this, but you can see these highlights here in the background are rendered more or less as smooth circles. So that's that bokeh that I was talking about before. This shot was with a small sensor camera. This is with my Nikon 1 camera, and it used a 10mm lens, so it's equivalent of about a 27mm lens in 35mm format. I shot it wide open at f2.8, and I was fairly close to this subject. So the background is slightly soft. You can still see the mountains and the clouds back there, but they don't quite give you that everything sharp depth of field that you might get had I stopped down a little bit more. And that creates a sense of isolation, and again draws your eye more towards the foreground subject rather than the background. The background merely presents context for the image. I mentioned getting up really close. This is something I shot with a 50mm lens. This is with the 50mm f1.4 at f2. Got really close just to show you that you can fill the frame. So this is a toy, is about 10 inches, 12 inches high. But you get really close and the entire background goes completely out of focus. This image, I used my 105mm macro lens, f4. Again, I was fairly close, tight framing. By using a wider aperture, in this case just f4, I frame that subject, but I render the background completely soft, and it presents a nice isolation. I don't have the distracting elements of the other items that were in this scene. I mentioned telephoto focal length, so I want to show you a few images that I captured with really long lens. So this is an egret that I captured in Florida with a 600mm lens, wide open at f4. So even if your lens isn't as fast, if it's a telephoto lens and you're focusing fairly close, you're still going to get really smooth out of focus backgrounds, and the 600mm f4 does just that. This is with the 200-400 zoom, again wide open at f4, but you can see that the background gets completely smooth. Same here. This is with a 600mm lens and a teleconverter, so I'm effectively shooting, I think, about 850mm. Yeah, with the teleconverter. This is at f6.3, so I'm not even shooting wide open with the converter. I'm stopped down a little bit, but because I'm using such a telephoto, a long telephoto lens, and I'm fairly close to the subject, the entire background just goes completely out of focus. Now, I mentioned bokeh, and that's the rendering of those out of focus backgrounds. This shot I captured with my Nikon 1 camera, but I was using a fairly fast lens. This is with the 32mm f1.2 lens. That's similar to using an 85mm f1.4 on my 35mm body. But what I want you to see from this image is not only that the background starts to go soft, but those little points of light, the Christmas lights, they get rendered as nice, almost perfect circles in the background. That's nice bokeh, even from this lens on my Nikon 1 camera. Same thing on this image. Same deal. Shooting with a different lens, an f1.8 lens, but what I want you to notice is that how the out of focus highlights become rendered as these nice circles. That's what we talk about when we're discussing bokeh.
All right, now we've had a chance to look at some images, we've seen lenses, and hopefully you have an understanding of why subject isolation could be a powerful photographic technique. I really like it because while there are some software plugins that try to reproduce that soft focus look or that shallow depth of field look of bokeh, I find that the real deal tends to be the best way of doing it. So if you want to learn more about this, you can always check out www.luminescentphoto.com. Go to my blog. I'll have links to some of these lenses so you can check them out. And until then, I'll see you next time on the Sensor Plane Photography Podcast.